am Vibha Chauhan and welcome to Chauhan classes Fun and Clear. So today I will explain Class-10th History Chapter 3 and our chapter is going to be the making of a global world. So the making of a global world. Now in this chapter we are going to discuss about globalization. Now we will see how the world in which we live has emerged. So basically we are going to see the globalization, the process of globalization, the economy, the build-up of economy, the impacts of First World War, and most importantly the Great Depression. So we'll discuss all these things in this chapter, and we'll see about the era, the pre-modern era and the modern era, the post-war era as well. So all these things we are going to discuss in this chapter. Now first of all, let us discuss about the pre-modern world. So the pre-modern world. Now you know what, that when we talk about globalization, we refer to the period 50 years ago or the 5 centuries ago. But you know what, that the process of globalization has been steadily growing during a very ancient time, from a very ancient history. You know what, that we have got evidences that there were traders, travelers, priests, and even pilgrims traveling all over the world in search of knowledge, opportunity, and spiritual fulfillment, and even to escape persecution. So you could say that there were many activities that were related to globalization going from a very ancient time. Like for example, Indus Valley civilization. Now, Indus Valley civilization, that was in 300 BCE, and you could see a lot of different types of activities that were going, and the process of globalization. You know what, that even at that time, they were interlinking of all the continents, of all the distant parts of the world through trades and travelers as well. So you could say that all those things were of the process of globalization. And on the basis of that, we could say that the process of globalization has been steadily going from a very long history, but has grown up from the last 5 centuries, and that is a pre-modern world. Now today we say that we are living in a modern world, but before then that there was pre-modern era, the pre-modern time, and that was the time of process of globalization, the main time of globalization. Now you know what, that all those people, traders, travelers, you could say that the priests and pilgrims were traveling all over the world carrying different types of goods, beliefs, values, money, currencies, you could say, and even diseases or germs. So now here the most important is that if a person is from the northern part of the earth, you could say that from northern hemisphere and is going in the southern hemisphere, then it was natural during that time that he would carry germs or diseases with him. So you could say that was spread by him. Different types of things, different types of beliefs and values were spread by him, as well as many medicinal factors too. So that was the process of globalization that was growing through the period of pre-modern era, and that we are going to discuss in this chapter with our first subtopic, that is Silk routes link the world. So silk routes link the world. Now that is our first subtopic that we have got to discuss. Now you know what, that when we are talking about the interconnectedness, the interlinking of the world, the continents that were present during that time, during the pre-modern era. Now you could say that there were many silk routes too. Now silk routes that were one of the important factor for the interconnectedness between Asia, Europe, and the northern part of Africa. Now basically silk routes doesn't mean that there was a route and in that route there were much silk, but it meant that the silk route that were for the textile and spice trade, or even for the Chinese pottery from China to the western countries, to the European parts, to Europe you could say. So that were routes that connected the China to the western countries, and they were born to be West Chinese boundaries, you could say. So they were known as the Silk Routes, and there were many Silk Routes by land and by sea as well. So there were many Silk Routes, and that tells us that there was a linking in the world. So you could say that these Silk Routes were linking the continents to each other, and there was trade going among them. Like for example, you could say that Silk Routes that were basically for the textiles and spices, and in some rare cases they were for Chinese pottery as well. But you could say that textile, that meant the cotton textile, the silk fabric, and all those fabric and spices that were commonly found in India and China so much. So they were traded to Europe, and so much of silver and gold flowed from Europe to India, to Asia, you could say that, not just in India but in the whole Asia. So that was the purpose of main silk routes, you could say. So during that time there were many silk routes, and even if that was for the textile or the spices, but there were religions going on as well, like the Christian missionaries, the Muslim preachers, and before all these there were Buddhism. So Buddhism that had arisen from the eastern part of India was spread into Europe as well, and that was going through Silk Routes as well. So you could say that these Silk Routes were linking the world together. Now our next subtopic that we have got is food travels, spaghetti and potato. So food travels, spaghetti and potato. Now we have discussed about the Silk Routes, but there were many other routes that were linking the world together as well. Like for example, the food that we eat today. Now you could say that there were many travelers, there were many people that were traveling around the world. So it's just obvious that they would introduce their crops that were grown in their country, that was being grown in their countries. It is just obvious that they will spread to other parts of the world as well, to the distant parts of the world. So through many discoveries, many crops were discovered, were spread to the parts of the world, to different continents, and even the ready stuff, that was the cooked food, you could say, the ready stuff was different because of the origins. Like for example, the noodles. Now noodles that were spread from China to the western countries, to Europe, you could say, and in Europe it became spaghetti. So that was the ready stuff that differed from each other, because you could say that traveled from China to western countries, and there it formed as a spaghetti. So spaghetti's main origin was in noodles. So you could say that there are differences between the ready stuff as well, because of their origins and because of the food routes that were you could say that through all the routes that were being spread in the world. Now the next example could be of pasta. Now when we talk about the pasta, the first thing you think of Italy. Now you think that its origin in Italy, but it is believed that it is actually that those Arab traders introduced Italy in the Sicily island of Italy. So you could say that pasta was spread to Italy by the Arab traders. So that was the origin of pasta, and many of these food trades have been going through between India and Japan as well, and that's why so much of the foods origin may not be known. So you may not know many of the origin of many foods, because it is very hard to trace them as well. So you could say that there were many foods trade among the people, among the countries and continents too, and that was the ready stuff. But what about the food crops? Now the main focus of food crops, you could say the main introduced of food crops was by the Americas, when Christopher Columbus discovered Americas. And Americas that you could say that included the North America, the South America, and the Caribbean part, you could say. So those were known together as Americas, and in Americas there were many crops. They were all basic crops like tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes, soya, and all those basic crops that we eat today were grown in America. And that's why when it was discovered by Christopher Columbus, they were spread to all parts of the world, you could say, in Europe, in Asia, you could say basically in these two continents, and that helped the people a lot. But you could say that these crops meant they could be the difference between life and death for the people. That for the potato. Now most important of all the crops was the potato. During that time, eating potato was just meant as a leisure. So you could say that if we talk about the potatoes, you could say that all these crops that were found in Americas were not known by the ancestors, our ancestors 5 centuries ago. It was only after the discovery of Americas that all these crops were known by the people of Asia and Europe. So if we were talking about the potato, now you could say that in Europe many poor people were dependent on potato because they were cheap sold and they could afford it more easily, you could say, and that's why many poor people were dependent completely on potato for their survival, and that's why you could say that they could meant for life as well because they were having so much pleasure in eating that, but they could meant for death as well, as in the famines during the time of 1840s, during the time of 1840s in Europe. In Ireland specifically, there was a very great, you could say that, famine of potato. Now what happened that all the crops of potato destroyed, were damaged, could not be grown anymore, and that's why many people died due to starvation because they were totally dependent on the potato, but potato could not be grown anymore on those lands, and that's why they were just starving to their death. So you could say that potato meant their life as well as their death, and that's why it's important to know the importance of all those food crops as well. So you could say that if we talk about the food travels, now here we have seen spaghetti and noodles, the pasta, how the food traveled from China and became spaghetti. That is the most important thing you must understand, and that is about the food travels and the food crops from Americas region as well that was discovered by the Christopher Columbus. So these are some of the things that you must remember. Now our next subtopic is conquest, disease and trade. So conquest, disease and trade. Now that these three things were interconnected to each other. You could say that these all were the means by which Europe became very kind of rich, you could say, and that was the main region of the conquest of America as well, America's region. Now you know what happened was that you could say that by many discoverers, Indian Ocean was discovered, and during that time in the pre-modern world, during the time of you could say that 15th to 16th century, there was a very bustling trade in Indian Ocean. There was so much trade activities going on in Indian Ocean and in India as well. But you could say that all those when America, before its discovery by Christopher Columbus, America was just isolated from all the world, parts of the world, you could say, and that's why it was not interconnected to any of the continents at all. But after that, when it was discovered, what happened was that all its food crops were becoming the lives of the people and the conquest of the people as well. Now they saw that when discoverers, when people from Europe saw that, traders saw that in America there was a very good fertile land, and that's why they were now thinking of conquesting it as well, and that was the main reason for the conquest of America as well. Now you could say that many legends were also spread in Europe, that there are many rich cities full of gold in America. So many people set off expeditions to America, and you could say that there were many rumors that were spreading too. And in countries like Peru and Mexico, precious metals like mostly specifically silver was found too much, and that's why European people were coming to take that money, to take that silver, and now were trading with that silver to India and China, with Asia, you could say. So you could say that they were getting money from America, and after that they were using that money for the trade with Asia, specifically India and China. And after that, you could say that those were the conquests, the Spanish conquest of America. The Spanish conquest of America was Spanish and Portuguese conquest of America. Now those two parties had conquered America's region, but it was not by its weapon at all, not by the firepower or the firearms, but mostly it was because of diseases. You could say that, you know what, that you already know that America was isolated from all over the world, and that's why the people of America didn't have any kind of immune system. You could say that small germs diseases like smallpox that were present in the people of Europe, in the people of Portuguese, the Portuguese people and Spanish people were spreading in America, that were leading to many thousands of deaths of people, because they didn't have any kind of immune system in them at all, as they were isolated from all over the world. But those people, like the European people, the Portuguese people and the Spanish people, did have a very big immune system, and that's why they didn't have to use any kind of weapon to those Americans, to those inhabitants of Americas, because they already were dying because of those germs or diseases. So you could say that they did have a connection. Conquest and disease did have a very big connection to each other. It was because of those diseases that the Portuguese and the Spain were able to conquer the Americas region, because they now were seeing the you could say the popularity. You could say that those food crops, those precious metals were being seen in America, and that's why many people were going to set expeditions off. They were not trying to conquer an America's region, and that's why it became a colony of Europe, of European powers, of many countries. So that was about the Americas. And you could say that there were trades that were going between India and China. By 19th century, until 19th century, India and China were the most prosperous countries, you could say. Now there was so much wealth in these countries. But after 15th century, China declared itself, China is said to have restricted overseas. Now it was being isolated by their people. You could say that China was now isolating itself, and that's why it had cut all the connection to all over the parts of the world. And in India, you know that it became a colony of Britishers. So you could say that is about the trade, conquest and disease. Now you have to see that they were conquering of the people because of disease and because of trade as well. Not they were trading too. So you could say that they were conquering, they were disease, and with that they were conquerings of America, and through that they were trade with Asia, with India and China. And after that the story goes like that China became isolated and India became a colony of Britishers, and that's why during that time Europe became the center of the world, because during that time it was growing rich as well, because many people had fled from Europe to America. You could say that in Europe the situations were worsening during the time period of 18th century, and that's why many people fled from Europe to America in search of work, in search of good you could say agriculture work, in search of good growing food crops. And that's why in Europe there were many rich people that were left, because all those poor people had fled from Europe to America, and that's why Europe became the center of trade center, the center of the world during the time period, by the time period of 19th century. Now our next topic is the 19th century, 1815 to 1914. Now we'll look at the 19th century, the situation of 19th century of all our world. That was the period of 1815 to 1914. Now you know what, that during this period, profoundly you could say world changed so dramatically. Now there were mostly the economic changes, cultural changes, political changes, social changes that could be seen in the 19th century between this period, between 1815 to 1914. That was of the period of 19th century, you could say, all over the world. So you could say that during that time, during this period, the profoundly world changed so much. And in the 19th century, economists have declared that there were movements of economy, or the flow of economy, and there were major three flow of economy. That were, the first was of the flow flow of goods, flow of trade, you could say. Now flow of trade means the trade between the parts of the world, between the continents, between the countries, you could say. Mostly we are going to discuss about the continents as we are looking at the globalization. Now you know what, that it mostly refers to the goods like cotton or wheat, the trade in cotton or wheat, mostly in those things that were in the trade so much during that time and even today as well. Now the next flow of economy was the flow of labor. Now you have you could say the trade, but you need labor as well for any work to be done, and that's why the next flow for the economy of the world that changed so much during that time was the flow of labor. And the third and last flow, but not least the flow of economy, was the flow of capital. Now capital meant that long-term or short-term investments overseas or in their own countries, in their own regions. So you could say that these were the three flows by which the economy had changed, had grown so much during the period of 19th century. And these three things that are the economy, the capital and the labor were connected to each other. So we will correlate all these things as we move further in this chapter. So let's move further into this chapter with our subtopic, that is a world economy takes shape. So world economy takes shape. Now we have to look at the economy of the world, how it took shape. Now first you could say that if you are looking at the origin, the shaping of the economy, then you could look at Britain, at Europe, you could say. And the first event that led to it, you could say, was the change in the pattern of food consumption, the mindset of the people. Now you know what, that till 19th century, self-sufficient countries were meant to be were meant to be prosperous. You know that mindset of people was that they were self-sufficient countries. But in 19th century, country like Britain. Now Britain, what it did was that in Britain, that it was showing that many people who were self-sufficient were, you could say that considered their standard of living was considered lower than that of other people who weren't self-sufficient in the food. And there were social conflicts as well. So self-sufficient in food, that means you are growing your own food and are consuming it. But it was now seen as a lower standard of living in Britain, and that led to the economy of the world, the shaping of the economy of the world. Because during that time, as I've already said, that Europe was the center of the world, because all those powerful countries like China, who had already isolated itself, and in Americas, you could say that had already became under the powers of Europe. So you could say that that's why Europe became the most powerful or the center of the world, and that's why the economy also took shape from it. Now that people were seeing different views or opinions in the consumption of food, in not self-sufficiency in food, and that's why now people, they were using that urban areas were expanding in Britain during that time, in England or Britain, and after that you could say that what happened was that urban areas expanded, many industries were also going in Britain, and that's why food prices, you could say that there was lower production of agriculture, food crops, that led to the prices very high, because in 18th and 19th century the population of Britain was growing too much, and that's why you could say that there was more and more demand for the food crops, and that led to the high prices of food crops. And now, as I've already said, that industries and urban areas were also expanding in Britain, and many landed laborers, you could say that landed groups, you could say that forced the government of Britain, the monarch of the Britain, the government of Britain to impose the corn laws, to ban the import of all type of corns from other parts of the world. So that you could say that there was a banning on the corn, and that was basically by the corn laws. So there wasn't any import of corn. but she could say that due to the pressure, now industrialists, all those urban expanders, the people who are living in the urban areas were against it, and that's why after when corn laws were scrapped, now economy was starting to take place. You could say that many industries that were going, and that's why the prices of food felt cheap, felt low, you could say not that much high, and now all people could afford it, and all those poor people, you could say that also led to the unemployment of thousands of men and women from their agricultural field, and that migrated from Europe to America. Nearly 50 million people migrated from Europe to America for a better future, and if we look at that figure of total world, that it would be 150 million people who migrated to overseas for a better future. So you could say that was about the economy. Now you could say that now industries had grown in Britain, and now the food production wasn't in the agriculture. Those people who were eating the food grains were eating the item, you could say the food that they were eating weren't from any field that was tilled by the for the farmer or peasant, but was from an agricultural farm miles away, and that was miles far away too much, and that was transported to them by railways, by railway links or the sea routes, and you could say that was also grown by agricultural labor who had just arrived even 4 days earlier or even 4 months earlier, and in that land that had been a forest a generation ago. So you could say that was the thinking of Britain, and that led to the change as well, because in most of the countries you could say that Britain people were more civilized during that time, because in most of the regions of country, many in the regions of the world, what was happening that many people weren't illiterate or united together. Just look at the case of India. Now there were many kings that were ruling over India in the Indian subcontinent, and that's why they were not united at all. That led to the colonization of India. So you could say that for the transportation of all those agricultural food crops to Europe was by the railway ships. Now many railway lines were being built and sea routes as well. They were transported either by ships, by the ports you could say, or by the railway trains you could say, by the railway links, and they were transported to Europe. So you could say that there were many countries like America, Australia, and in Asia as well, they were fulfilling the demand of British people, the demand for the food crops of the British people, because as I said that we have to correlate the economy with capital and labor. Now for doing this much production, there was a need of labor as well, and that's why labor was supplied from different countries to meet the demand of Britain, and it was a labor and as the capital as well. Many industrialists from Britain were now investing in different countries, and in that countries, in those regions like in America and Australia, all those production was done and labor was needed that were collected by the slaves were needed. You could say that by there were many laborers that were in those factories, in those industrial production. So you could say that was the economy of Britain that led to the increasing economy, because now this time you could say that now the prices of goods and now the prices of food crops weren't that much, and it was leading a good way to the people of Britain. So you could say that was about the Britain, and the similar cases on a small scale could be seen in India as well during the time period of British Indian government. Now British Indian government had supplied some canals to the regions of Punjab in the semi-desert area so that there would be good production of wheat and any other crop, and you could say that those areas were known as the canal areas. You could say that canal supplies where they were. So that led to the very good economic increase, overall development of economy, because the pattern of the food consumption had changed. As you could say that now people were leading on industries and in urban areas were civilizing themselves, and that led to the you could say that the development of economy overall in Europe or in Britain. So that is about the economy of Britain that led to the economical you could say the economic development in overall world. Now our next subtopic is role of technology. So the role of technology. Now overall there was a great role of technology as well. Now all those steam engines, you could say that in railways, in steam engines, ships and telegraphs played a very important role for the interconnectedness, for the connection of all the continents and the economic development as well. You could say that it was because of the inventions that were invented by great inventors. It was because of their inventions that the world could go. In the 19th century, there was this much change because of technology as well. If it wasn't for those inventions by those great inventors, then it wouldn't be possible this much change in 19th century. So you could say that technology played a very important role in the 19th century. Now there was, if we take an example, that it will be of meat. Now you could say that from America, earlier in the 19th century, in 18th century, what was going on was that from America, all those live animals were transported from America to Europe, in Britain, in Europe, by the sea route. They were packed in the ships, and you could say that they were now delivered to Europe, and after that they were slaughtered. But you could say that led to many problems. First of all, they were taking too much space. As you could say that in live animals and in their meats, who would have more space taken? Obviously, all those live animals will take too much space, and in that much transportation, in that much traveling, many fell ill, many lost weight, most of the animals lost weight, and many died of voyage as well. And that's why it was creating too much problems for all those traders who were trading in meat. But after, in 19th century, after there was a discovery, there was the invention of freeze, you could say that refrigerator. Now you could say that it was a refrigerator. It was because of the refrigeratorship that all those meat was now delivered, transported from America to Europe as a frozen meat. So now they were smuggled from the country that they were coming from, the continent they were coming from, Americas, from Australia and Africa, and from there they were smuggled earlier and now were sent to Europe to meet its demand by, you could say that, as a frozen meat. Because earlier in 18th century, any poor person couldn't afford meat, because you could say that there were so much problems in the transportation of meat, and that's why the prices of meat were too much in Europe, and you could say that poor people couldn't afford it. And you could say that even today and in that era, there was a very great kind of importance of meat as a leisure of the people, and that's why they couldn't afford it. But after, in 19th century, most of the people, not all though, but many of the people in Europe now could use meat in their regular diet, as a regular diet in their breads, you could say. So you could say that was the role of technology. And not just this one invention, there were many inventions like the railways, the ships, and all those things, the weapons as well. So you could say that was the role of technology, and that led to the importance of change, the making of globalization, the making of global world in the 19th century. Now our next subtopic is late 19th century colonialism. So the late 19th century colonialism. Now these were all the good sides of all those taking shape of the economy, but there were dark sides as well. That was a colonialism. Now you could say that in Europe there were many European powers like Britain, France, Italy, and they were now very big powers like the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungary Empire. Now they were making colonies all over the world. Now firstly they were Britain, France, and Portuguese. You could say that they had come into India. India became also a colony of Britishers and some of the parts under the French or Dutch. So you could say that that dark side of all those things were the colonialism. And you know what? That there was a slave practice that was going in Africa as well. Now many people were sold as slaves to all the people of Europe, to all the colonists, you could say. So you could say that there was a dark side that was of colonialism, and there are examples as well. If you look look at the map of Africa, you will see that the countries in Africa, their borders are just like that. They have been measured by scale. Aren't they all straight, you could say? You might have observed it when compared to the maps of other continents. The map of Africa is like that. It has been measured by scale or the ruler, and it is just very equal. You could say that it's very straight down, because all those earlier than that, the great powers like Britain, Spain, Belgium, now you could say that when they conquered Africa, were now dividing all those regions among themselves, and for doing so they had to measure the land. So for doing so they were measuring the land and were dividing themselves those lands, and that is the reason why the map of Africa looks like this. By 1890s, Belgium had also risen as a power, as an European power, and Germany as well. So you could say that those were the reasons. You could say that all because of those reasons, there were many European powers that were becoming the colonial, that were making colonies all over the world, in Asia, in Africa mostly, and because of that in Australia too, you could say that there was not so much colonialism in our country as well. Now USA, if you look at the US after 16th century, it had also become a colony power. So that is about the colonialism. In the late 19th century, there was so much colonialism. You could say that in India too. Now what happened was that the East India Company came into India, and after that our country became a colony of that company. So you could say that the dark side of all those economic development was a colonialism that was by the Europe, because during that time in 19th and 20th century, the center of the world had become Europe. So that is about the colonialism. Now our next subtopic is render past the cattle plague. So render past are the cattle plague. Now you know what, that cattle plague, that was a disease that occurred in Africa, that came into Africa and was a fast spreading disease that led to a very great impact. It affected the people's livelihood too much and the local economy too, and that led to the conquest of Africa kind of it as well. So let's discuss about this cattle plague. Now if you look at the Africa, now from earlier times or ancient times, it had abundant land with relatively very less population. So you could say that in Africa there was a very low population compared to that of land, and that's why in Africa there wasn't any kind of wage worker. So there weren't any wage worker, all people were doing their own work, and that's why you could say that there wasn't any kind of process or system of wage system in Africa. Now when Britishers came, you know what, many plantation workers, you could say that many industrialists went to Africa, they were now starting plantation farming, or their own you could say agricultural farming, but for doing so they needed wage workers who were doing work for the wages, but they couldn't find any in the Africa. But you could say that they had come in Africa because Africa is a continent with rich minerals, with rich resources and minerals, and that's why it attracted many Europeans. They came as a plantation owners, you could say, or the agricultural farmers, agricultural land owners, but they couldn't find any wage worker in Africa, and that's why the British government that had colonized Africa, those all European governments that had colonized the Africa, were now making laws so that all people would do the wage work for their companies, for their plantations, and for those agriculturals, you could say agriculturists that were from Europe, that were very rich person. So you could say that in Africa there weren't any wage worker because they had their own land, they were rich with their own land, but Europeans needed wage labor, and that's why many laws were now formed so that all those Africans would have to be a wage worker. Like for example, there was a rule that there would be only one person from a family to hold the land. That was the inheritance of land rule, and there were many other rules for their pastures as well, for their cattle as well, in the lands as well. So there were many restrictions that were imposed, and you could say that many taxes, so much taxes were also introduced, were also increased in Africa, so that all people, inhabitants of Africa, wouldn't be able to pay that tax and would work as a wage worker in those plantations on agricultural farms, so that Europeans would have even more and more money. So you could say that for doing so they were making laws in Africa, but you could say that that didn't help them that much. It was helping them, but didn't that much, but not that much, you could say. The situation changed in 1880s when a very fast spreading disease among the cattle was occurred in India, occurred in Africa. Now what happened? That rinderpest or cattle plague. Now this was a disease among the cattle by which so much of the cattle were now dying. You could say that earlier, specifically what happened was that in the 1880s when Italy was conquering the arterial region of Africa, now British sent these many cattle, so many cattle from Europe to Africa, to that region where Italian soldiers were fighting, and in those cattle there was this disease, and that spread in 1892. It spread to the southernmost part of Africa, that is Cape. So it spread to the time of 1892. It spread all over Africa, and 90% of the cattle had died in this disease, and that's why now people had no choice, because you could say that their livelihoods, livestock were not killed but now dying because of this disease, and that's why they had to be a wage workers in those plantations. So you could say that because of this disease that is known as the cattle plague, commonly it is known as the cattle plague, but you could say that it is also known as the rinderpest. Because of this disease, all people had to work as a wage worker, and that affected the people's local livelihood or the economy, because earlier those people were prosperous, happy, but now they had to work, and they were now becoming slaves, you could say, because of this disease. So you could say that this disease had affected so much in Africa continent. Now our next subtopic that we are going to discuss is indentured labor migration from India. So indentured labor from migration from India. Now if we talk about the indentured labor, do you know what it means? Now indentured labor means that a contract, all those bonded labor who had signed a contract with the contractor to work under those contractors for a specific period of time, so that they would be given passes to their region or country. So basically in common language, in common terms, simple terms, you could say that whenever people move from one region to another region, but now they want to come back to their own region but they don't have that much money. So for doing so, there would be many poor people, contractors, who would make them sign a contract with their will, and you could say that would make them work for 5 years, 10 years, or even more than that, and after that they would promise them that after that they would return them to their own region. Those people would go to their own region with the money that they have. But you could say that indentured labor during the time in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, there were too much. There were so many indentured laborers from India to all overseas, because many people from India, for a better future, to look for work, were now migrating to other countries, and mostly their destinations were the Caribbean and Fiji. You know that in Caribbean there was the Guyana region or the Trinidad region. So in those regions, and in Fiji and Martiana. So in these countries, their main destinations were these countries. But when they went there, now they want to come back to India, but they can't because of lack of money. They don't have that much conditions, and that's when contractors make them sign the contract of indentured labor. Now what was happening in actual reality, you could say, was that that those were the greedy contractors. They were saying that they would be very good conditions, that they were making them work in coal mines, in the plantations, in the agricultural fields, in everywhere, in the construction sites as well. But you could say that they were saying that there would be very good conditions, there would be very good conditions of working, very good standards of living, wages too, and all those things. Well, those, you could say, the rumors, all those they were exaggerating the condition of working, and our Indian people were just, you could say that they fall for that trap and just signed the contract, and that led, when they went to work, they would see that the condition is just worse. So for the indentured labor, you could say that the condition is very worse, and that's why they were just a vicious cycle was created. That those are people, those are migrators who migrated from India to other countries, who were unwilling to sign the contract or were less willing to sign the contract, were forcibly abducted to work on those areas. So that was going on. But you could say that those indentured laborers were mostly from the areas of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, the central India, like the regions of Madhya Pradesh and the regions of Tamil Nadu as well, where they were seeing that there wasn't that much development, or there wasn't that much, that for their work. There was so much unemployment. Even today, in some of these areas, is unemployment. So you could say that that's why they migrated from India to other countries as an indentured labor. So that was it. But in 1900, finally the Indian government said that we don't need that indentured labor. We have to abolish this indentured labor. But still, you could say that it takes many descendants of those indentured laborers are still in those countries. Like for example, you might have heard the Nobel Prize winner, that is V.S. Naipaul, or the cricketers like Srinivasan or the Rameshwaran Sarwan. So those, don't you think that these names sound like an Indian name? It is because they are the descendants of all those indentured laborers. So you could say that there are still many descendants of those indentured laborers in foreign countries, in abroad, you could say. So that is about the indentured labor migration from India, and many people have suffered from it as well, because in India during that time, even if they were in India, they were still. But you have to see that when they were caught in those traps, now they have their own ways of surviving in those conditions. Now many people were trying to escape from those regions, that they just ran off. If they were caught, they were punished with very severe punishments. But many people survived in those conditions. How was that? Because they were you could say that, blending all the religions, all those cultural activities, like you have music, the chutney music in Caribbean region, and there were many things, like there were many the Muharram, the annual Muharram in Trivandrum was converted in the blending mixture of religions. So you could say that were all these things that were going in the indentured labor, labor migration from India. And you have to remember that in the previous chapter we had discussed about the Baba Ramchandra, who was a who could say that, who was a leader of Uttar Pradesh for the non-cooperation movement, who was also indentured labor from the Fiji country that had returned to India. So you could say that you have to remember some of the special names of those indentured laborers as well. So that is about the migration, the indentured labor migration from India. Now our next subtopic is Indian entrepreneurs abroad. So Indian entrepreneurs abroad. Now let us discuss about the entrepreneurs that were Indian entrepreneurs and how were they doing abroad in foreign countries. Now that for any food crop production, for any plantation, for any industry, what was the most important thing was the capital. And for having capital, there were banks. That all those big people, big plantation owners were borrowing money from the banks in Europe. Bank, you could say. But what about those humble peasants who weren't of that much flashy background? So for them, you could say that, have you heard of that Indian entrepreneurs? Like, now do you know all of these Indian entrepreneurs, like for example Shikari Puri Shroffs or Nathukotai Chetiors. Now these were some of the entrepreneurs, Indian entrepreneurs who were doing their business abroad. Now they were financing the export agriculture that from their own funds or were borrowed from Europe. So they were financing all those humble peasants, you could say. So that is about the entrepreneurs. Now there were some of the entrepreneurs that were abroad, that were Indian entrepreneurs abroad and were funding with their own fund or with the borrowing money from Europe, and that led to their success as well. Like for example in India too, in the Hyderabad region in India as well, then there were Hyderabadi Sindhi traders. Now these traders they were just beyond Europeans. You could say that they were doing the tourist business too. You could say that all those swellers, now whenever tourists came, they just swelled. So you could say that this is about the Indian entrepreneurs abroad. That is how they were doing for their humble peasant, you could say. Now our next subtopic is Indian trade, colonialism and the global system. So the Indian trade, colonialism and the global system, what were their connections? Let us discuss about it first. Now as all of you know that Indian trade, there was a very good trade of Indian manufactured cotton, the cotton textile in our country. It was very good. It was exported to Britain as well. But as the period of industrialization grew, what happened was that now there wasn't that much of demand of cotton textile from India, and that's why that affected the Indian manufacturers, the local manufacturers as well as mills that had opened. Well, mills were opened after that, but all those local manufacturers who were doing the textile business were now in shrink, you could say, because of the growing industrialization in Europe and specifically Britain, you could say. Now what happened that the contribution, not just in Britain, what was happening was that in the international business, in the international trade, now India was losing its position, you could say, in the cotton textile, because in Europe, in the international market, if I'm saying about international market, is generally the USA or the Europe. Now in those regions there was industrialization, and that's why you could say that the position of India in that trade was now decreasing. Now in 1800, the total contribution of cotton textile in international trade of India was 30%, and that had decreased to 15% in 1815 and even to 3% in 1870. So that you could say affecting the global system as well, because in India now you have to connect that because of colonialism there is an effect on Indian trade, and that is affecting the global system as well. But on the other hand, there was a very good demand for the raw material, raw cotton, you could say, that wasn't manufactured at all, because in those industries there was a need of raw materials as well that could be provided from India, and you could say that was not increasing, not just decreasing, it was now increasing. Now it had increased from 5% to 35% from the year around 1815 to 1871. So you could say that from these years now it had increased from 5% to 35% and was increasing too. So you could say that in the 19th century the manufactured cotton was not decreasing, but the demand for raw material was increasing from India. And at the same time, as all of you know that opium trade. Now you know that Britishers' main strategy of trade was that they were just trade surplus. What was happening that in China, if you look at the example of China, now they were trading with opium. Now you know that Britain made opium in our country, in India, and exported it to China. And with that fund that came from China was used for the import of tea from China. China. So you could say that is known as a trade surplus because the value of the export was higher than that of import, and that's why that fund could be used with the tea trade with China. And the same was happening in India too. Now Britain was having all those raw materials from India, but that couldn't be compared to that of import that was from Britain. So that was a kind of cunning strategy of British people. You know what, that they always had less value of import but had a very good value, high value of export, and that led to a shrink in the world economy as well as the trade surplus Britain, you could say, because during that time the industrialization, the urbanization in Britain was ever growing compared to any other country in Europe, any other European country, you could say. So you could say that was Indian trade and the colonialism and the global system. Now we have seen that there was a trade surplus, but what about that fund that was sent to British, you could say, the Britain? Now those funds that were sent to Britain, that they were getting from the exports, you could say, that were now used to so-called with the home charges of all those British officials in India for their house remittance, for their that pensions and all those things for all those British officials. So you could say that is about the Indian trade, how is connected to colonialism and the global system, you could say. Now our next topic is the interwar economy. So the interwar economy. Now what was going on? If we look at the impact of the First World War, now we will see the impact of First World War on the economy. First World War, as all of you know, that during the time period of 1914 to 1918, that had a very great impact all over the economy of all over the world. Well, it was fought by the European countries, but it did have connection with India, all other countries, parts of the world as well. It did have a very bad impression, bad effect on the economy all over the world. So now we'll discuss about it. What did it have on economy? Because you know that in the first half of the 20th century there was this world war, and it had already led to economical instability. But after that, it led to 3 decades to recover it, because in 1945 there was Second World War as well. So with another war there was a sophisticated, sophisticated situation and a kind of very bad situation, the Great Depression of 1919s, and there were many things that had a very great bad impression on economy of all over the world because of this world war. So with our subtopic, let's discuss about it, that is wartime transformations. So wartime transformations. Now let us discuss about the First World War that was started in 1914. Now as all of you know that this First World War was fought by 2 blocks. You could say very big blocks. First was the Allies. In Allies there were initially 3 countries, that were Russia, France and Britain, and it was later joined by the US in 1917. And on the other hand there was these countries like Germany, Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungary Empire. So these were fighting this First World War. They had their own issues of their own states, that territory regions, and of Balkans region as well, the Bosnia-Herzegovina. There were many issues between them, and that just led to this First World War. That caused a very great havoc all over the world, not just in Europe. You could say that this was fought by the Europeans, but it had impact all over the world. That was for the first time when these you could say that powers, very big powers of the world and of Europe as well, were fighting against each other and were causing a very great havoc. And it was for the first time when people actually saw the use of machine guns, the tanks, aircrafts and all those mechanical, the technological weapons in the war. It was for the first time of everyone, So it was the First World War, and it did have an impact all over the world. Like for example, in Britain, for these Allies parties, now you know what, that Allies had won this First World War, but for doing so there were many things that were going, like many soldiers were recruited, either they were forcibly recruited or they were recruited by their will, and there were many deaths. Around 9 million people had died in this First World War, and many of them were against their will to fight this First World War, and around 20 million people had injuries on them. So these are the number of, you could say that number data about the deaths and injury people. So you could say that that was the First World War, and in this US, you could say that US that was earlier an international debtor now had become international creditor. How was it so? Because you know that when this First World War was being fought, now all these big powers were willing to do anything to fight their enemy. You could say that to destruct their enemy, and that's why US, you know that Britain borrowed so much money from US, from the United States, and that made the US as an international creditor, you could say, because it was giving loans or money to all those small countries as well as Britain, and that you could say that increased its economy as well, because in that region, in the US now, what was happening, what was going on was that now those people who had borrowed from international companies from other countries now were being creditors, you could say. So you could say that was the First World War transformations that was fought by the Allies and the you could say that Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Germany on the other hand. So that was the First World War, that was in the 1914 to 1918, and that you could say that had a very great impact on the economy as well, because when it was started, the government thought that in 1914 it was started, so government thought that it would be over by the Christmas, but it lasted for more than 4 years. So you could see that how intense that fight would be, that war would be, and that was, you could say that all men were now fighting in the war, in the First World War, and women were expected to the work that men were doing earlier in their place. So women were doing that work, and men were fighting in the wars, you could say, and all those companies, all those industries were now restructured to make the war equipments, to the war related goods, to supply them, to supply Britain, to supply Europe in the First World War, to fight that war. So that is the First World War transformations, because for the First World War, everything, every country, region, every colony were now reorganized. Now the taxes were introduced, increased, you could say, the revenues were increased for the you could say for the war equipment, because you need financial support for the war as well. But it was given by the US, but still you need more and more. So that was extracted from the colonies like India, China, and many other countries. So that is about the First World War transformations. Now our next topic is post-war recovery. So the post-war recovery. Now that First World War was fought and ended in 1918, at the time period of middle to last 1918. But what about the recovery? Now their recovery was difficult as well. Now its recovery for Britain, you could say that most having problem. It was having more and more problems. As I've said that this First World War was very intense, and that's why you could say that its recovery, the post-war recovery was very difficult, was having so much crisis, you could say. Like for example, the Britain. Now Britain, you know that earlier in the pre-war period, it was a leading economy. It was a leading economy all over the world. But after that, it had become a debtor from the US, because it needed more and more money, and that's why it had become a debtor of US. And you could say that when it was fighting the First World War, now India and Japan had built their more and more industries, and that led to the competition internationally between Britain and Japan. And in India, in Indian market, these Britishers, all those Britishers lost their dominance as they had in the pre-war period. So you could say that this First World War, its recovery was also as difficult as it was to fight it. Well, in this fight there were many deaths and many such situations, worse situations in the countries too. So you could say that its recovery was also very difficult, because Britain, as all of you know, earlier than that, Britain was a producer of wheat, was the largest exporter of wheat. But after that, when it was fighting the First World War, now countries or continents, regions like America or the Australia, you could say that these regions were now seeing it as an opportunity, and now are growing more and more wheat and exporting it as well. So when Britishers, you know, that Britain stopped when that war ended, so now you could say that Britain started to produce wheat again, but that led to the mass production of the wheat, but not the consumption of that. So the prices of wheat fell too much down, and that's why all those farmers couldn't take it anymore, couldn't bear it anymore, because they had to do something for their survival as well. They had to sell it for their survival, but it wasn't sold even at the very lowest prices, and even if it was sold, but it didn't help those farmers who were growing that. So you could say that that First World War had already caused havoc in the whole world, but after that its recovery was also as hard as it was to fight it. Not just Britain, but also other countries too, because they did have their own economic laws and all those financial laws and all those army laws, because in the First World War there was a loss of people as well, the man force of as well. In Britain, you know that in industries there was less family income now, because in family there weren't that much man force, and that's why there was less income of families. So that is about the post-war recovery. Now our next subtopic is rise of mass production and consumption. So rise of mass production and consumption. Now that we have seen about the Britain, the case of Britain, its recovery, its post-war recovery, and we have seen that there was so much uncertainty among people and there was so much unemployment in Britain. But in the US, the condition was just opposite. Now it was gaining more and more power, economic development, you could say, and it was very easy for it to for the post-war recovery. Now, as I've already said that it had become a very great overseas lender, because it had already, well, you could say that borrowed money to other countries like Britain and many European countries, and you could say that it was already had become a very big overseas lender, the biggest overseas lender you could say, and now its main focus was in mass production and its consumption as well. Now you know what, that in Britain, in America, in this US, now there was a mass production that was going, so much mass production you could say, and so much whenever it was grown as a food crop, as well as the you could say that inventions were also in the mass. Like for example, Henry Ford, one of the mass production pioneer, that was Henry Ford. Now Henry Ford was inspired by the idea of assembly line at Chicago. Now in this assembly line, what was happening was that he saw that meat that was chosen by the butchers one by one at the same time to keep the pace with it. So he was inspired by it and did the same for him, for his company, you could say, that was of cars. Now you know what happened, that he started his own factory, his own company of cars, and had to hire many laborers, many workers to work in his company, in the factory, you could say. Now in that factory, many workers had come, and in the conveyor's belt they had to do the same work at the same time. You could say that the same work again and again, as mechanically and consecutively, you could say. Now what was happening, that like fitting a part of car. Now they had to do it consecutively, and they had to do mechanical it as well. So they were just doing hard and harder work, and that's why they left his factory, you could say. But again, with desperation, Henry Ford declared that the wage would be the double of that it was before, and that's why many workers again joined his factory, and that led to the mass production of cars. Now the first car that was produced in his company, you could say, in his factory, was a T model Ford car, and it was the first mass produced car in the world. Not the first car, but the first mass produced car. So you could say that was the story of Henry Ford, and he's still, that in his books, in his quotes, he said that it was a very good decision to double the wage so that it would be more and more profitable. So you could say that mass production and mass consumption in America led to many in economical development in USA, in the United States of America. Not just one story, but still many more. Now all those, that there were more and more demands of washing machines, of telegrams, and all those, that home furnitures. Now there were more and more demands of refrigerators, washing machines, and all those things, and that led to the house demand for it, because if there were more and more houses growing for the people, they would buy more and more furnitures and cars as well. So that was a condition, that was a cycle, a very good rich cycle that was being created in the USA, and that was leading to economical development as well, and leading to prosperity in their country. So you could say that was a mass consumption and the mass production. So you could say that by 1923, now it had gained its own power, it had become the superpower of the world, and was now recovering the you could say that economy of other countries as well. Now it was having more and more imports from Britain, and was giving the capital export to Britain, and that was helping Britain to recover its own economy, you could say. And that was the situation till 1923. That was just for 6 years. After, in 1929, something happened that led to havoc, a very great bad situation all over the world. What was it? Let's discuss about it with our next subtopic, that is the Great Depression. So the Great Depression. Now you know that in 1929, Great Depression struck all over the Europe, and not just in Europe, all over the world. In Europe as well as in Asia. Mostly it was in Europe, but you know that in exact dates you can't find, because they had the Great Depression was in different countries and different dates on different times of an interval of 1 to 2 months. Now there were many reasons behind this Great Depression. Now you could say that this Great Depression was an economical loss. It was, you could say, that so much loss of economy. Earlier than that, there was in 1923 there was a recovery of economy, but after that in 1929 there was Great Depression, because in Europe, in Britain, and in European countries, the prices of agricultural products were falling too much, and that's why it was impacting you could say that it was having more and more impact on the agricultural workers, on the peasants, you could say, and that's why it was leading to a Great Depression that caused the havoc all over the world. Now what happened actually, that there were mainly 2 reasons you could say you can find about it. First, that already after the First World War there was so much, you could say that borrowings, there was so much already. USA had given so much money to other countries, so it was already so hard to pay that money, and that's why those countries were becoming kind of debtors of the USA. And the second was that mass production. You know that production was too much, but the consumption wasn't, because most people were from the rural areas who were being affected by this Great Depression, because you know that there was so much mass production but weren't sold in the market. Even with the lowest of lowest prices, it wasn't sold at all, and that was leading to the Great Depression. And you could say that when they were borrowing, then they wanted to borrow the money from the USA. Now USA was having problem as well. Now in USA, many, you know, that peasants, many people were now a little bit panicked to borrow, to give money to the other people, to the other countries. So that's why in USA the conditions were having Great Depression. You could say that USA as an industrial country was having too much effect of this, the Great Depression, you could say. Now many people had to sell their houses, their cars and their other furnitures to pay off their debts, because now they were getting in more and more debts. So you could say that the USA which was the industrial, still is the industrial developing country, was affected too much. The most affected, you could say that the most severe affected by this Great Depression was the USA. And that's why this Great Depression, that still it was you could say that the greatest depression of economy ever in the world, in the history of our world, you could say, or of our ancient history, you could say. So you could say that this is a Great Depression. This was a Great Depression that led to so much hunger, starvation and so much unemployment. Because of unemployment, there was more and more anxiety among the people, uncertainty among the people. People were now looking for jobs everywhere around Europe, Asia and America. They were now, you could say that, were willing to do anything for their survival. So you could say that there was so much unemployment, so much starvation in this Great Depression. Now what was the impact of India? Let's discuss about it with our next subtopic, that is India and the Great Depression. So India and the Great Depression. Now as I've already said that Great Depression did have a very bad impact all over the world. Now in India too. Now you could say that in India you could say that there was export of raw materials and there was import of manufacturer items. But after the Great Depression stuck in India, what happened was that people couldn't sell their items, they couldn't sell their raw materials, and they were not able to pay the revenues. But still the British government wasn't reducing all those revenues or taxes, and it was leading to you could say that's to more poverty in our country, because people, that in all those people who were affected by the Great Depression were from the rural areas, not from the urban areas, urban dwellers, you could say. So all those rural people had to, you could say that, weren't able to pay the taxes, the rents of their houses, and that was leading to problems of them. Now you could say that all those little manufacturers, all those who supplied raw materials like jute, cotton, were now suffering too much. And you could say that, and it was at this moment in 1931 that Mahatma Gandhi started the civil disobedience movement that helped the people a little bit, but not that much. As I've already said that it was declared off, and after that it was started again, but it wasn't that much successful. But in the first phase it was really so much successful. So you could say that it helped the people, the local people, the peasants of our country. And you could say that by this Great Depression, during the period of 1921 to 1934, the prices of wheat had decreased by 50% or to 60%. So there was a kind of half of the economy was just wasted down, was just distracted, you could say. So you could say that the Great Depression did have a very bad impact on India as well, and mainly the rural area dwellers, because in urban areas they had their fixed rents, they had their fixed income, you could say, by their rents, as they were landlords, by their lands, by their houses which they had given on rents. So they were having their fixed kind of income from all those tenants and all those workers who were doing work on the lands of their own. So you could say that is about the Great Depression's impact on India. Now our next topic is rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. So rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. Now the First World War had ended, and after around two decades after it, there was Second World War, that was against the Nazi Germany. Now again in this Second World War, there were two parties. First was Axis powers, mainly comprised of Japan, Italy and Nazi Germany, and on the second hand there were the Allied powers, that were have already said that Russia, Britain, France and the US. So this Second World War was fought mainly by these countries. Now there were still many small countries that were fighting, but if you look at the big picture, that it would be these two powers. Now again, in this Second World War, there were many deaths of the people. Around 3% of the total world population of 1939, that was around 60 million people, had died in this Second World War. But you know what, that more people that died were the civilians, innocent civilians, you could say, not that much soldiers, because you could say that they were dying, they had died because of the causes of the Second World War, and that's why they had to die. And again, in this Second World War, there were many bombardments and many, you could say, that weapons that were even more technological weapons. And it was in this Second World War that the US, you know, that the United States of America used the atom bomb in the Hiroshima region of Japan. So you could say that that was for the first time when atom bomb was used, a nuclear bomb was used. So that was for the first time, and again it caused so much a kind of havoc in the whole world, in Europe and in Asia. You know that whenever there was Second World War or First World War, the most influenced countries, the most affected countries were from Europe and Asia, because in Asia they were colonies of Europe, and that's why it had to be affected as well. So that was about the you could say the Second World War. But what about the post-war era? Now again, in post-war era there was the US. Now it was because of the US that there was a recovery of the economy, the global economy, you could say. And after that, you know what, that in this fight there were two major things that led to the kind of recovery of economy, of global economy. First was the dominance of the US, that was the military power, you could say that the economical and the political power of the US, that led to the economical recovery. And the second was that the Soviet Union, as I've already said, that it had become the Soviet Union. You have already seen it in the last class history chapter. So you know that at that time, during that time, it was known as the Soviet Union or the USSR. So during that time it was known as USSR, that is present time now Russia. So you could say that also had its own dominance that led to the defeat of the Nazi Germany. Now you know what, that this Russia or the Soviet Union, now earlier it was just a backward agricultural country, but now it had become a very great power in Europe, because when all countries were kind of facing the Great Depression, Russia was seeing its own profit, its own development, and that's why it could be like this. So that was about the post-war era. Now let's discuss about all those post-war era things in more detail with our next subtopic, that is post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods institution. So the post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods institutions. Now you know that all those economists and politicians, now that they saw the Second World War, and now they came to the conclusion that there were two things that had to be done to prevent any kind of war and any kind of revolts in the country. Now first they learned from the Second World War was now that first was that there wasn't just need of mass production, but there was a need of mass consumption as well. And for mass consumption, there must be good income of the people, and for the good income of people, there must be high rates of employment. There must be employment provided to every people of the country, and for the employment, there must be. It is not that just employment is limited to the markets, because we can't just kind of insist on the markets or kind of believe on those markets, support those markets, lean on those markets. So government has to interfere in the employment, for the employment of all people of the country too. So government has to make laws or projects, anything that it has to make more and more employment in their country. And secondly, they learned that for employment, for mass employment in the country, there is a need of the government rule, the government control on the trade as well, on the imports and exports as well, so that there would be bans or restrictions on any kind of import that is leading to less employment in the country. So these two things were kind of decided, were kind of observed from the Second World War by the economists and the politicians. Now for doing so, what was happening was that now a conference was held at the Bretton Woods, that is in New Hampshire in USA, and that meeting was by the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in 1944. So that conference was held in Bretton Woods in the New Hampshire region of the USA in 1944, and in that there were two establishments, that were the IMF and the World Bank. Now IMF, that is the International Monetary Funds, and the World Bank. Now these two were established by different powers and were for the recovery of the economy of all those European countries, of all those European powers, you could say Western countries. So these two were, and you could say that was about the Bretton Woods. These two institutions, these two were known as the Bretton Woods institutions or the Bretton Woods twins. So you could say that whenever we say the Bretton Woods institutions, that means IMF and the World Bank. Now you know what, that they were known as the Bretton twins too, but not that much commonly. And that post-war era, that was after the Second World War, is known as the Bretton Woods settlement. So these are some of the terms that you should know or remember as well. So that is about the post-World War era and the Bretton Woods institutions. Now what was happening was that now these IMF, that is the International Monetary Unit, and the World Bank had been established. Now their main headquarters are in the USA, you could say, and you could say that it was for the economic recovery, and that's why many countries, Western countries, were rushing to it as well. And you could say that it was making many projects or creating funds for the Western countries. So that is about the Bretton Woods institutions or the post-war era. Now our next topic is the early post-war years. So the early post-war years, now that these Bretton Woods institutions were established, now what about the early post-war years? Now there were good conditions. The conditions were being better now. Well, now you could say that the the average unemployment rate was about 5% all over the Western countries. And if we look at their increasement, if we look at their development, then there were more and more development. Like you could say that there were more and more exports and more development in the Western countries. As you could say that they were generally for the Western countries and the Japan, you could say Japan and the Western countries, they were not focusing on the developing countries that we will discuss later. So you could say that was about the early post-war years. Now all those countries, Western countries, were rushing to it because they had to maintain their economy. They wanted economical development, and that's why they were supporting, they were leaning on those Bretton Woods institutions. So you could say that the early post-war years were very good. Were not very good, but okay, you could say, were well, you could say, because now the conditions were being better. Well, you could say that better now. Now our next topic is decolonization and independence. So decolonization and independence. Now you know that even by the Second World War time, even by the time of Second World War, many countries were still colonies of European countries, of European powers, like in Asia. Now you could say that in Asia there were still many countries that were the colonies of all those European countries, and that's why after two decades, all those countries had become themselves, were now a kind of independent from the European countries, had the decolonization period in their countries. But there was a problem, that was that they were suffering from poverty more and more. So now that all those European countries had left all these countries of all these colonies that were earlier colonies, pre-colonies of Britishers or all those Europeans, now you know what happened was that now they were suffering from poverty because they were still new formed countries and didn't have any backup plans. So they were still kind of suffering from poverty, and all those institutions like IMF and World Bank that was established. Now they were established for the Western countries' economical development, and that's why they were not focusing on the poverty, the most suffering poverty in India, in China, and any other countries. So now that was happening, but after that, what happened was that when those countries recovered their economy, well, now they were not leaning on these institutions, on these Bretton Woods institutions, and that's why these Bretton Woods institutions were now focusing on the pre-colony countries like India or China or any other Asian countries, you could say. Now they were focusing more and more, but still didn't get it. You could say that all those pre-colony countries didn't have any kind of benefit from it, because all those countries, they were still indirectly under the rule of Western countries, because in those institutions like in World Bank or in any IMF, now those decisions were made by the Western countries, but the USA had its own veto power. That's why you could say that they were still indirectly under the control of all those, and they were not getting profit. All those countries weren't getting any kind of profit, and that's why you could say that they were not performing, they were not thinking of their own economical development by themselves, because IMF, World Bank didn't, you could say that wasn't that much wasn't that much giving that much support to those countries. So that was about the decolonization and independence. So that was the independence of India, China, and many other Asian countries. Now the next and last topic of this chapter is end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization. So the end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of the globalization. Now what happened was that now it was good. The economical development were okay. There was stability in the economical development, the political situations. But that was just for time of 1960. After 1960, again there was a kind of strike of economical loss, and that affected the US as all. You know what, that during the time period of 1944, after the end of the Second World War, what happened was that the dollar, you could say that the value of dollar was too much, because it was related to the gold. So there was $35 per ounce of gold. But now what happened, that it was decreasing, and exchange rates were changed from fixed exchange rates to floating or flexible exchange rates. So you could say that was going on in the USA and all other Western countries. Now one more problem to all those pre-colonial countries was that they weren't getting any support from IMF or the World Bank. Now they were saying that all those institutions were saying that if they wanted loan or a kind of money, then just ask the Western countries. So they were now just, you could say that, leaving them alone in the middle of their journey, you could say. So now it was the end of Bretton Woods to all those pre-colonial countries, and it was a time for entry of MNCs as well. MNCs, that is the multinational companies. Now they were looking at the countries in the Asia, because they wanted the countries where there were low wage workers, and that's why you might have heard of China. Now you have seen that many toy companies, many toys or phones or any devices like TVs, laptops are mostly from China. Why is it so? Because many of the MNCs are in China because of its low cost structure, and most importantly the very low wage workers. And in India as well there are low wage workers, and that's why still there were some MNCs that came into India. But in China there were even more and more low wage workers, and that's why there are many MNCs that are in China, as you have already, you could say that, observed it in your daily life. So that is about the end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization, because you could say that Bretton Woods had ended, and now in Asia there was a kind of globalization, because things were growing more and more, and all those geographical economic were transformed as countries such as India, China, or Brazil. Now they were undergoing many transformations, many economical transformations. So that is all we have discussed in this chapter. Now in this chapter we had seen about all that process of globalization. In starting we had seen the pre-modern world, and we had seen how the situations were in Africa and Europe and in Asia as well. Then we discussed about the First World War, its impact, and the Second World War. Now here we have seen about the Great Depression and many more things that we had discussed in this chapter. So this is all I've discussed in this chapter, and still this chapter is also very important on the competitive purposes and university exams, because you know what, that this chapter is still a very lengthy chapter, so you could say that that is very important for your studies. So I've discussed all topics and subtopics, and the remaining chapters of this book will be covered in the further upcoming videos. So thank you very much.